Chris is an assistant professor in the Social Justice Institute here at UBC. His research focuses on trans-Pacific discourse of literature, games, and films through the lens of empire studies, queer theory, and creative writing. His first academic book, Transitive Cultures, Anglophone Literature of the Trans-Pacific, examines Southeast Asian diasporic novels focusing on queer migrants, those who resist ethnic stereotypes, and those who feel few ties to their ostensible homelands. His second academic book, Open World Empire, Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games, sees video games as an artistic expression of global empire by playing them erotically and as Asiatic commodities. His articles have appeared in venues such as Cultural Studies, American Quarterly, and many others. Chris received his PhD in English from the University of Washington in 2013, and before coming to UBC in 2018, he worked as an assistant professor of English at the New York Institute of Technology in Nanjing, China, as a postdoctoral scholar at Chinese University of Hong Kong Cultural Studies program, and as an assistant professor of humanities and creative writing in Hong Kong Baptist University. From 2009 to 2013, he was a lead organizer for the Asian American Studies Research Collective in Seattle. And from 2011 to 2013, he was a program director and grant writer for the Seattle Asian American Film Festival. In 2013, he founded the podcast New Books in Asian American Studies and has remained a co-host since then. Chris writes fiction under his pseudonym Kawika Guillermo and is the author of Stamped, an anti-travel novel, and the queer speculative novel All Flowers Bloom. He serves as the current editor-in-chief of Decomp Journal. His presentation, entitled Making Queer Asiatic Worlds, Performance and Racial Interaction in North American Visual Novels, brings us here today. Thank you very much, Chris. It's all yours.
Thank you, Nuno, and thanks for Yubi and for everyone for coming. Like we said, I am coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And I also want to begin by thanking Anne Murphy and the staff at the IHRC and the MOA for supporting this event, and to acknowledge all the seen, unseen, and historical labor that has gone into creating this space and this time for us to have this conversation today. So this presentation builds upon my second book, which is up on the upper right here, Open World Empire, which argues that video games push the global imagined separations of America and Asia, as their very genres and histories challenge the separations of region, nation, and place. As many scholars in Asian American and Asian Canadian studies have pointed out, the separations of Asia and North America are entangled with anti-immigrant racial formations that were violently equipped and remade during the Philippine-American War, World War II, the Cold War, which included the Korean War and the Vietnam War, which secretly and illegally included the bombings of Laos and Cambodia, and of course is still with us today. Today, the US is in Asia in multiple ways, as its 50th state of Hawaii, as colonized territory in Guam or Guahan, as military bases that scatter the region, as hegemonic global media, and as the ubiquity of American and Canadian capital, and of course in the English language. America is also present through what Chen Quanqing has identified as the American sub-empires of Taiwan, South Korea, the Philippines, and others that establish imperial roots and buttress an American Pacific transnational garrison state. Okay. So these trans-Pacific imperial relations conditioned the emergence of games industries in both the US and Japan, where the origins of US games were entangled with military technology and the growing IT industry of Silicon Valley, while in Japan, video games emerged, according to Martin Picard, through a media mix of multimedia companies who were already producing toys, card games, television shows, and manga. In this context, video games, or gimu, were extensions of other media and were, quote, not linked to an essence of any kind, but to a market. Similarly, in their influential book, Games of Empire, in the middle here, Greg D. Portier and Nick Dyer-Weatherford compare, quote, the hacker clubs of the 1960s that liberated games from the Pentagon with, quote, the delinquent manga artists that animated Japan's revival of a burned out American industry in the 1980s. While American gaming, in this brief snapshot, emerged from militaristic and IT industry hackers, Japanese games came from delinquent artists devoted to other crafts. Despite the hybridity of games as Asian/American aesthetic and mechanical products, the Asia-America spectrum has thus remained an implicit and political and historical separation rooted in histories of militarism, tech, and artistry. As Porter and Weatherford argue, the shift from American to Japanese games in the 1980s is often narrated as a political and historical reclamation, quote, where games were rescued not by the military-industrial complex from which they had sprung, but by the victims of its atomic bomb. As an entertainment media that emerged during the Cold War, video games were made possible by manufacturing routes that include extractive mining in Africa, processing factories in Malaysia and southern China, and innovations in Japan. So my book, Open World Empire, claims that games take a step beyond blurring the boundaries of Asia and America and put the terms themselves and the distance that they suggest into irrelevance. In this presentation, I will explore how visual novels particularly explore this irrelevance of Asia-America through their Asiatic irreverence. So this presentation will feature the following arguments and go in this step-by-step basis that you see here. First, that visual novels in North America are aspirational and that they build queer, utopic, and seemingly anti-racist worlds through the Asiatic space of the visual novel form. So I'll talk a bit about what that is, what Asiatic is. In so doing, visual novels also allow us to condition and understand the Asiatic as a means of repairing the traumas and distances of American imperial cultures, a means to de-Cold War, as Chin Quanqing might put it. I will then, number 3, look to queer visual novels to make this argument. So 3 by non-racially identifying North American designers, and the virtual novel Butterfly Soup, a game by a queer Asian American designer, Brianna Lay. While the games by presumably white designers attempt to create queer and anti-racist worlds by salvaging progressive Asian characteristics from the more patriarchal Asian characteristics that they see, Butterfly Soup and other games designed by queer Asian Americans make no such attempt, and rather allow us to see the potentials of Asiatic media as a form of creative and reparative art. I will then conclude by showing some of my visual novel in progress that I'm making with a group of students called Stamped, an Anti-Travel Game. So let's get started with this term, Asiatic. It's a very loaded word, so I'm hoping not to use it that way. But this is basically like one of my big key terms in Open World Empire. And as I argue there, video games are tied to Asia even when they contain no explicit racial representations, as they are manufactured and innovated upon in Asian contexts and remain colored by Asian associations as new media products. So games can be seen as, quote, Ludo-Orientalist. This is what Tara Fickle writes in the book above me, wherein, quote, the design, marketing, and rhetoric of games shape how Asians as well as East-West relations are imagined, and where notions of foreignness and racial hierarchies get reinforced. In Open World Empire, I use the term Asiatic to characterize games for its, quote, forms, spaces, and personages that many players will find similar to Asia, but that are never exclusively Asian or are obscured from any other recognizable racial genre, or are not foreclosed to other given identity tropes. Following this, I will continue to use this term Asiatic to explore how visual novels carry Asianness as a form, a style rather than substance, a technology rather than an essence. So as a very quick example of Asiatic, we can look to the 2019 episode of Black Mirror, Striking Vipers, which follows 2 old friends pictured here, Danny and Carl, 2 masculine straight Black men who reconnect after 11 years apart by playing a newly released virtual reality version of Striking Vipers, a fighting game they once played as college roommates. As in previous episodes of Black Mirror, virtual reality appears as a militaristic technology symbolizing techno-paranoia. In the series 2016 episode, for example, Men Against Fire, which I discuss more in depth in the book, augmented reality technology forces American soldiers to visualize refugees as monstrous terrorists. And this is a big issue in the news right now, if any of you have heard. Xbox and Microsoft just ended up selling a big apparatus, virtual reality, augmented reality apparatus that started as a video game and is now being sold to the Pentagon. And a lot of the designers are really pissed off about that because they had no idea they were developing war materials. But this is a very common thing in video games. So this is usually what happens with virtual reality in this series and in real life, for example. Yet in this episode of Striking Vipers, VR technology is portrayed through the softer forms of video game play and Asiatic cuteness, as Danny and Carl revisit their childhood through inhabiting the virtual characters Lance and Roxanne, two Asiatic characters played by, one is a Asian man and the other is, I believe, a French woman, but who dresses in these kind of Asiatic clothing. The game, nevertheless, remains a threat, even in the soft form, not so much to moral and ethical sensibilities, but to the heteronormative forms of futurity and family, as the Asiatic form of the game permits the two friends to act out their erotic desires for each other by having passionate and repeated sex. So even as the game Striking Vipers, like the real game Street Fighter and Tekken, features typical racial stereotypes for the purpose of enacting violence, the game's Asiatic associations with bizarreness, silliness, and Asia itself allow new erotic relations to emerge. The game's homoeroticism is more taboo when seen from the point of view of the episode's black male leads, who since their time apart have incorporated further into the norms of heteropatriarchy and capitalist success. As studies have shown, Black players and players of color outnumber white players proportionally and are found to gravitate towards Japanese-made fighting games that so often ridicule racial representation. Indeed, the episode's poster patterns the same slash effect and bisexual lighting of the Oscar-winning film Moonlight, a movie that is also famous for portraying Black male queerness through an Asiatic form, as the film borrows heavily from the visual styles and cinematography of Hong Kong films, particularly the films of Wong Kar-wai. Through its imperial and Asiatic designation, Striking Vipers provides a space for queerness to emerge, not against, but through the practices of Black and racialized masculinity, which are inescapably also erotic practices. The Asiatic also challenges many of the Orientalist ways of seeing Asia as something distanced and completely unknowable and uninhabitable, except by white experts with high pedigrees in Asian studies. As Shumei Shi, Naoki Sakai, and Gavin Walker have recently argued, traditional means of studying Asia have reinforced logics of distance so that white Western scholars are thought to contain an air of objectivity, a remote control feature where distance from Asia is, quote, this is Shumei Shi, quote, artfully deployed given the context of global flows of information. In response, scholars in Sinophone studies, Trans-Pacific studies, and Pacific studies have sought to disrupt logics of distance with new forms of mapping, new ways of seeing linguistic and artistic commonalities within a region, while revealing histories and forms of art whose logic is not distance, but an indistinguishable blending of self and other. Asiatic forms in games refuse the logics of distance and separation. Rather, they dwell in an Asiatic space of simultaneity, sharing, overlapping, and blending, though not with the coevalness of, say, a national imagined community. In games, one is no longer able to recognize which exact characteristics are Asiatic or Americanish, but at the same time, one can recognize degrees to which some game genres appear more Asiatic than others. While we might see, for example, first-person shooters like Doom or Call of Duty as perhaps the most Americanish genre developed in Texas, for example, visual novels, I argue, would be at the most Asiatic end of this spectrum. And this is an imagined spectrum, of course, not real. So let's get to virtual novels. So until the late aughts, visual novels were known as a niche market in North American video games, one that spoke to both the sexual diversity of games from Japan, as most were known for their pornography and gay or BDSM romance, as well as the aesthetic styles of anime and manga that were typical of the genre. So visual novels basically look like kind of like an anime comic, but interactive, and they are much more than that, as I'll go into. A 2006 survey found that in Japan, visual novels made up nearly 70% of PC games, As Dominique Guy writes, visual novels have traditionally been ignored in game studies, despite their global impact because they are too erotic and too similar to novels, while they have also been ignored by Western literary critics because they are too game-like or too Asian. Much of the audience for visual novels in North America come from the narrative game traditions of choose your own adventure style games made in Twine or an RPG Maker. And they're cheap, free, do-it-yourself game engines, basically, that are known for having more progressive, queer, and anti-racist designers and games. So many have argued that these independent, do-it-yourself game engines have caused a kind of troublemaking root of disobedience that flows against the heteronormative game cultures writ large. So all the games that I analyze here were created with this program, RenPy, a free-to-use engine that preceded the vast democratizations of games that happened around 2009 and 2010 when other game engines started to come out. So all the games investigated here also used itch.io for distribution, and all games are free with suggested donations. Itch.io is the most popular platform for indie games with over 650,000 games in its catalog, over 9,000 tagged as visual novels. Even though they represent a small part of its total games, visual novels have been extremely popular on Itch. At the time of writing, 6 of its top 10 rated games are visual novels. And as game scholars have argued, these do-it-yourself infrastructures exist outside and in opposition to mainstream gaming. Visual novels are also the main genre that distributors rely upon to prop up the sexual and racial diversity of indie games. As during the Black Lives Matter 2020 mobilization, itch.io announced a, quote, visual novel romance collection for Black trans lives that included 14 games by queer designers. It may seem ironic to many Asian gamers that the most progressive, queer, and anti-racist games in North America come from a genre that is very closely tied to Japanese conventions of gender, sexuality, and race. Indeed, game scholar Seyoung Kim points out that even for scholars and fans who do take Asiatic forms into account, Japan often plays the role of a, quote, moving signifier, especially in terms of sexuality. Kim compares the Western gamer's attitude to Japan as an example of Edward Said's positional superiority, where, quote, producers and fans can capitalize on Japanese media sexuality in its art style, its mise-en-scène, but immediately cast it aside as deviant at will. Much of this positional superiority reiterated in game studies is dependent upon a logic that sees Asia and America as two very distinct entities, even as many games resist this binary. As many Japanese pop scholars have pointed out, anime, video games, and visual novels were partially inspired by American cartoons like Disney, Western arcade games, and adventure games like King's Quest. Whereas today, game cultures have begun to see Japanese, Korean, and Chinese games as queer compared to American-made shooting games. In Japan in the 1980s, the shift toward science fiction in popular culture, which produced many of the dystopic worlds of anime and visual novels, has been attributed to feminist science fiction movements in the United States. Koichi Iwabuchi famously argued that Japan's post-war popular art undertook a strategy of strategic hybridism that, quote, absorbs foreign cultures without changing its national / cultural core. I don't know why I'm doing these hand gestures here. This hybridism that Iwabuchi talks about does not unsettle nor blur sexual or racial identities, but fixes and, quote, reinforces the rigidity of these boundaries by consistently calling attention to the Japanese culture's ability to absorb while still remaining pure. Video games thus appear as global objects, as lacking in nationality, or as odorless, as they're often called. For Christine Yano, whose Pink Globalization book is over here, Japanese products in North America are often shaped as whiteface commodities, as they have ambiguous origins and make no attempt to challenge or to deviate from the masculine gaze or white middle-class values. And their unmarked elements indicate where normative power lies. In the Asiatic world of odorless games, visual novels are exceptional, as until recently, their popularity has remained sequestered to Japan, with many virtual novel companies refusing fan efforts to translate or localize these games. Unlike most Japanese popular art that circulates the globe, visual novels were rarely intended to leave Japan, and their cultural odor has not been sanitized to the same extent as other game genres. As scholars have recently argued, queer aesthetics like camp, queer romance, and Asian American representation manifest most in Japanese games that have not been catered or have not been very well catered to Western audiences. As such games have proven, as Rob Gallagher has argued, quote, conducive to precisely the kinds of projective identification, enthused amateurism, and felicitous mistranslation that Eve Sedgwick identifies with camp. For Hiroki Azuma, visual novels are especially subject to an audience's erotic projections, as their play tends toward a, quote, double layer structure. So on the one hand, you have sexually explicit material, sexually explicit character, sprites, pornography, and all that. And on the other hand, there are pleasures of also collecting and discovering all the intertextual elements that facilitate these erotic subcultures. For Azuma, the communities of visual novel players are thus based upon erotic feelings rather than on national or racial identities, and its members play by sharing information and appreciation in online spaces where communal creative worlds can emerge. It's also important to note that when visual novels are produced in Asian countries outside Japan, they are not necessarily seen as queer or progressive in any way. In the case of South Korea, for example, Christine Ganzon has shown how virtual novel games mainly reinstate gender roles and often present women as glorified caregivers and can only contain certain performances of femininity. So this idea of visual novels as progressive, as queer, as anti-racist even, is quite particular to North American audiences. And part of this is because these audiences respond or try to respond to the conservatism that they see in a lot of Japanese and Korean made visual novels, and that a lot of the indie gaming community in North America tries to respond to these critiques by making in-kind visual novels that are in more queer, anti-racist spaces. Okay, I'm gonna move to now talking about some actual games here. So in July 2018, the tabletop game designer, Adam Kubel, this is right above me here, tweeted, quote, "Can we please have more queer games that aren't visual novels?" Speaks to exactly how much people in the game community see these as queer. Naturally, this statement garnered much controversy from queer visual novel designers and players who argued that VNs were a unique medium that allowed them to imagine an alternative to the white and heteronormative worlds of AAA gaming. Yet, what we do not see discussed in either this tweet or in the conversations that it generated is that the very game that it was responding to, which is behind me, AVB's Heaven Will Be Mine, is entirely populated by characters of color, as are other visual novels that attempt to queer the genre's archetypes, such as Doki Doki Literature Club, which is further on the lower right here, lower left for you guys, and Christine Love's Analog, A Hate Story, which is on the upper left here. Though racial differences are entirely present within these games, the games themselves are almost entirely read and marketed as queer rather than anti-racist or diverse. These three games are also made by designers who very rarely, if ever, reveal or discuss their own racial ethnic background, and attempt to deploy the Asiatic space of visual novels to make queer worlds, but in so doing must also contend with what they perceive as the patriarchal and sex-negative associations of Asia. So these games thus capture the anxiety of needing to separate the Asiatic reparative worlds of visual novels from the Asia of Orientalist design. So let's begin with Doki Doki Literature Club. So this is the biggest breakout hit of indie visual novels. It's on its surface a Japanese-made bishoujo virtual novel where you play as a man trying to date women. The player inhabits a blank slate young male, so someone you never really see, who's supposed to just identify with the player. You're invited to an all-female literary club and encouraged to romance one of the four archetypical maidens. So there's certain archetypes in virtual novels that are quite common. The first is Sayori, an archetypical Genki girl, whose energy and emotion can turn into a maddening love for the player. Then there is Natsuki, the archetypical tsundere character, the red hot girl, whose pink clothing and red hair reflect her aloof and fiery temperament, which can grow into a maddening love for the player. Then there is Yuri, the blue Oni to Natsuki's red Oni, who is shy, cute, and literary, but hides a maddening love for the player. She is the archetypical Dandere. Finally, there is Monica, the literature club's leader, a quintessential yandere archetype, meaning sickly in love, whose spirited and commanding surface, she's right behind me here, is offset by a maddening love for the player. Notice there's a theme here. So most of these visual novel archetypes are conditioned by this dere suffix, short for dere dere or dere ru, meaning love-struck or fawning. As fans have pointed out in many heated arguments that I've been a part of, some of these dere terms, like dandere, are actually far more common in English than in Japanese. So these archetypes are thus Asiatic in the sense that they use Japanese terms to assign their foreignness, even as there are no ostensible Japanese racial signifiers that might distinguish them as such. The archetypes thus don't function as characters to identify with in a narrative of empowerment, for example, but as sprites that contain intertextual erotic elements that are meant to be collected in various online databases. So one interesting thing about this game here that I'll quickly go through is that it does try to queer these archetypes, revealing their excesses of erotic desire and their artifice as mere collections of database elements. So in its ending, Monica, the yandere behind me, who is vulnerable to bouts of sickly love, reveals that she is actually an AI, artificial intelligence, who has been corrupted by the game's script, and she then deletes all the other girls from the game's memory in order to try and capture the player. Doki Doki thus revises these virtual novel archetypes to reveal them as artificial fetish and as interchangeable elements within a database, while also relying heavily on techno-orientalist tropes of Asiatic women as cyborgs, artificial intelligence, and as having an obsessive need for the Western male. The second game, Analog: A Hate Story, was the first breakout visual novel that preceded Doki Doki Literature Club in 2012, and was the first visual novel ever available on the largest game platform of Steam. Yet, like Doki Doki, this foray into the Asiatic space of visual novels also traces the anxiety of needing to separate the queer Asiatic from the patriarchal and techno-orientalist depictions of Asia. Analog is very blunt in doing so, as it focuses on a Korean character with modern feminist sensibilities who is awakened from cryostasis into a spaceship based on the Confucian patriarchal norms of Korea's Joseon dynasty. Love's disdain for the Joseon is clear in her interviews, as she claims she considered being drunk throughout the writing process to deal with, quote, the Joseon dynasty's reprehensible history, claiming that she chose to base Analog on the Joseon dynasty because of, quote, the way its treatment of women degraded over time to be so horribly dehumanizing, it seems like it'd be a fate worse than death. Love's choice of recreating the Joseon dynasty's horribly dehumanizing attitude toward women may seem quite random and Orientalist to us. There are a wealth, of course, of other locales that Love could have chosen, like the infamous sterilization, sex worker vulnerabilities, and forced adoption of Indigenous people that have continued in Love's own country of Canada. Yet Korean history is not entirely incidental to Love's reparative project, as her attempt to creatively remake the visual novel seems to also require her to distance the parts of Asian culture she finds meaningful from those she finds patriarchal. Love's remaking of an Asiatic form becomes later present in the practice of cosplay, which is thematized throughout the game as a means of queering Asian patriarchal norms. I should also point out that Christine Love and AVB, who I'm talking about next, are both trans women. So the 2018 game Heaven Will Be Mine, written by AVB, plays with techno-orientalist representations of technology, but does so by dividing technology into two types: the queer, transformative, and erotic technologies of Asia, and the technologies of surveillance, violence, and control of US militarism. B describes Heaven as a lesbian yoi, and as, quote, a giant robot anime if all the mecha pilots were girls and all the gay subtext was actually just happening instead. Inspired by animes like Neon Genesis Evangelion and Gundam Wing, Heaven makes a world where queer and trans people of color share erotic experiences through the mecha robots that they pilot. So these Asiatic mechs, or self-ships as they're called in game, resemble armor and conduits to erotic experiences and queer desire. So these queer Asiatic selves of the mechs also contrast the game's main antagonist, or one of their main antagonists, which is the autonomous unit, this blue figure thing on the left here. It's a militaristic drone that doesn't have a shape that remotely resembles a person. It's basically like the opposite of erotic and queer. It's extremely simple. It just kills directly on impact, instantly lethal. It takes all the drama and expression out of fighting. It's the ultimate anti-climax. This unit is made by humans rather than the lab-bred pilots that inhabit the mechas, and resemble the militarized technology of war that shoots only to kill. And we can think of American drones, for example. In contrast, the game's queer and trans characters see their Asiatic mechs as perfect bodies, where desire and friendship can form, quote, the fullness of being human. Despite their trans and queer characteristics, the three main characters of the game are worth a critical pause, as they each take on a racial ambiguity conventional of Japanese virtual novels. Though all these games, like Heaven, queer many conventions of virtual novels, they also seem to keep the colonial baggage present in their use of racial ambiguity. And according to Soraya Murray, a games studies scholar, many games responding to white heteronormativity can fall easily into what she calls a quote, aesthetics of ambivalence, where whiteness is erased, reversed, or set aside in order to tell stories of feminine empowerment or queerness. Such racial ambiguity could be read as anti-racist, where characters can represent a multitude of marginalized gamers who have been denied representation in games. At the same time, ambiguity becomes a burden saddled onto the characters who then cannot chart a specific history or lineage, and thus repeats the gesture of insisting that race is merely visual. If there is one grand exception to the post-racial world-making of many queer visual novels, it is Brianna Leigh's Butterfly Soup, which I've taught many times. I might have some students here who I've made them play it. But it was released for free in 2017 to win PC Gamer's first Best Visual Novel Award, and to quickly become the #1 rated game on itch.io. And it's a title that still holds to this day. Butterfly Soup is the most likely, I can't find another one, but it's most likely the first video game ever by a queer Asian American woman about queer Asian American women. While Butterfly Soup seems similar to the games discussed earlier, its main difference is in offering an intersectional politics, racial politics that makes no attempt to merely separate the Asiatic from Asia, nor does it offer a primarily aspirational form of world making that attempts to imagine a post-racial, post-homophobic future. Instead, Butterfly Soup focuses on the complex and sometimes bigoted experiences of growing up queer and Asian in Oakland, California. Asia in Butterfly Soup is not something one can pick and choose qualities from or something to salvage. It is present in one's parents, grandparents, brothers, and sisters, as well as in one's queer chosen family, and is thus indistinguishable from North America. Unlike the previously analyzed games, Butterfly Soup's use of Asiatic archetypes is not to display a distanced irony to the real Asia, but to remake these conventions to express the Asian/American queer experience within a politics of irreverence. So we might thus read the revisioning or the queer Asiatic tropes in the previous games, Doki Doki, Analog, and Heaven, as ironic in Roland Barthes' usage, as, quote, a signpost that destroys the multivalence which we might expect from a quoted discourse, meaning that the ironic text for Barthes positions itself against a discursive other, whether as a text, a history, or a culture, in order to signal itself as playful and the other as innately serious. Irreverence, in contrast, seeks not to disown these other narratives, but to contest the silencing of sexual and racial forms within dominant narratives by putting these themes front and center. For the scholar Valerie Chepp, irreverence appears in Black feminist media as unapologetic, vocalized, playful, and often raunchy. Similarly, Butterfly Soup does not seek to make its relationship to Asian cultures and histories ironic, but to transition the virtual novel's Asiatic tropes into an explicit and unapologetic narrative that allows its own Asiatic form to shape its meaning. All of Butterfly Soup's characters are queer or trans, and each deeply subverts the stereotypes of their roles through irreverent humor that allows each character to reclaim their desires within rather than despite their racial backgrounds. So like the previously discussed virtual novels, Butterfly Soup's 4 main characters, I'm blocking one, sorry, contain observable traits similar to the Dere archetypes. Yet their Dere assignments do not overlap with their Asian ethnicities, or they do overlap, sorry, with their Asian ethnicities and Asian American identity traits. These are also all South Asian and East Asian, which is very different than most Asian American, Asian Canadian narratives. Arkasha, for example, is the energetic, outgoing Genki girl, traits that are rooted in feeling like she has lost much of her heritage due to her parents' strict Americanization. Similarly, Minso is the harsh but loving character, represented as an androgynous and violent tsundere. Her personality is rooted in her parents' strict South Korean gender norms. Dia is the Rei Ayanami Dandere archetype, who is silent, shy, and harbors unexpected desires, love for men in this case. Her personality is rooted in the anxiety formed around her racial difference and low test scores. Finally, Noelle is a yandere archetype, much like Monica from Doki Doki, but here remade into the role of a Taiwanese American model minority. Whereas virtual novel characters in games like Doki Doki do not have their own histories, but are presented as collected elements within a database, Butterfly Soup's characters resist such cataloging and rearrangement. For these characters, their associated archetypes are not roles that they can keep at an ironic distance, but are inseparable from their racial backgrounds, their Asian American experiences, and their queer desires. So I claim that Butterfly Soup is not in tension with the Asiatic so much as inhabiting it with all its messy contradictions, which becomes evidenced in its multiple queer and trans Asian American women's subject positions. So as Saito has argued, one of the most powerful mechanics in virtual novels is the player perspective, which is usually either a blank slate or is you oscillate from one character to another. In this game, though, the player oscillates, they do both. They're both a blank slate and they're oscillating. And this is not meant as a way of gaining empathy or sympathy for the characters so much as being able to see all the roles equally, of being able to see themselves as both subject and as the object of desire and pain. So to me, it in a sense captures more what Jose Esteban Munoz might call the discord, turbulence, and out of syncness of queer and racialized communities. Lastly, as Tara Fickle and I discussed with the game designer Marina Kitaka in a forthcoming roundtable, Butterfly Soup also challenges the very game-like forms of virtual novels themselves, as it consistently thematizes its own constrainment of choice as a defining feature of being a queer Asian American woman. One cannot choose a character to play as or to romance or to dress up, and there are no multiple endings. There is a constrainment of choice that becomes a meaningful shift in the kind of privilege and power that it denies the player over the game's queer and Asian characters, whose very stories are about being constrained themselves by heteronormativity, poverty, and white supremacy. These young Asian women, the game seems to state, will find their queer selves and love each other, whether you, the player, like it or not. Where Asian and queer characters are expected to be controllable, such wayward young women, says Butterfly Soup, cannot be tamed. So I'm going to use my last couple minutes here to just quickly introduce you to the game that I've been working on with some students over the past year. Began in April 2020. It's called Stamped, an Anti-Travel Game. It's based on my first novel, Stamped, an Anti-Travel Novel, which I write under my matrilineal name, Kavika Guillermo. And there are students and others in the slide behind me. So it's me, Daniel D. Kalangan, Jess Lau, Braden Lemker, Moses Caliboso. Those are the students, as well as 2 community artists, Sophia Trung and Maya Espiritu. So Stamped, an Anti-Travel Game is an adaptation of my first novel into a piece of interactive art that explores ideas commonly taught in social justice, critical race theory, queer theory, and histories of colonization. Aimed at students and classroom settings, the game will help students learn the everyday practices and appearances of colonial histories and race. Simply put, the game follows marginalized young individuals from North America traveling and living in Asia who confront the multiple and overlapping histories of colonization, war, and genocide and tourism. Loosely based on my own experiences living and traveling in Asia for well over a decade, the game seeks to articulate racial themes within an ever-expanding travel context, and to make histories of colonization, war, and capitalist empire palpable through encounters with spaces in Asia. In other words, it seeks to embrace the irreverence of the Asiatic through the in-your-face discussions of race and marginalization, while at the same time bridging the distance between Asia and North America by rendering visible histories of violence, exploitation, and tourism. So there are 3 different genre types that you just kind of loop throughout this game. The first that you get is the travel blogs of the main character, Skylar Farallon, who is a mixed race, queer, Filipinx-American, who is traveling as a means of escape and self-harm. This section is the most engaged with histories of colonialism in Asia, as players can move through dense cityscapes. And these are actual like travel photos I've taken. It's quite embarrassing to leave myself out there, but whatever. And as you're going through these cityscapes, you also hear Skylar's narrative, which is quite cynical and almost like too historically aware. This section also presents the player with choices that will always mean missing out on particular spaces and histories. And so you're constantly asked if you want to go left or go right or go straight. And all that you know is that you're missing out some other place. So I wanted to confront the player with the constant unknowability or unspecialty that they have going into these places. I shouldn't say unknowability because that's not exactly what I'm going for. The second section is the virtual novel. This is by far the longest section. This is what the player spends by far most of their time doing. It takes place, here the player will meet this young, rowdy, queer and immigrant youth who inhabit a bar in the small South Korean town of Gimhae, where I also lived for a year teaching English. And I take inspiration here from Butterfly Soup, of course, in letting the player oscillate from character to character with adjustments in play style that represent each of the characters' personalities. So for example, if you play, there's a section where you play as Arthur, who is the self-deprecating, poor white dude on the left. And in this section, the player can only make choices that begin a rant, but the player doesn't know exactly where that rant is going, and it could last for a long, long time. Such choices include cop to it, deny that shit, or make a thing of exercising your freedom. And any of those choices will lead to long rants about nothing. In contrast with Connie, who is the woman centered on the right, every choice that is available is snarky, sarcastic, or potentially violent. So these restrictive choices, choices of constrainment, as we talked about with Butterfly Soup, express the lack of options that we often have through our own mental and discursive boundaries and our own social positioning. Finally, the third part of gameplay, this is still very much in progress. The top picture above me is only half done. But this part begins when the player talks to one of the other characters for long enough that they begin to reveal a travel episode or some backstory. And so these are all in point and click style, where the player interacts with these dreamlike paintings by the artist Maya Espiritu. These sections delve into the most troubling experiences of travel, as well as the difficult forms of violence and debilitation that the characters felt in North America, all the things that caused them to travel and live abroad in the first place. So let me just say that our status on the game, we currently have a 20-minute demo readily available. And I have to say this, so sorry, but we are also looking for funding. So please contact me if you know of any. I would be remiss not to say that. Here are some receipts. Thank you very much. I should take off the share screen, yes.